Welcome to this week's edition of Engagement That Scales with Rachel Happe. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Shannon. It's great to be here. And this week we've got Gretchen Schmelzer. I want to say T all the times.
It has a T. It is pronounced with the T.
Okay.
In German, Z is ZT.
Yeah. Okay. And one of the reasons I invited Gretchen today is, one, she's a psychologist and she studies trauma and anxiety and how to deal with crises generally. And we're in a crisis. And two, she went to Mount Holyoke. And so, you know, I'm always a fan. We had another Mount Holyoke alum. I'm so excited because I worked in technology my entire career and I've had very few opportunities to like elevate other awesome Mount Holyoke women. So I'm excited by that. And then I realized that you and I went maybe not quite 10 years apart, but we're both rowers. And I forgot to get out my rowing sweatshirt. But anyway, Gretchen, if you will tell us about your background, some of the work that you've done, and what's on your mind these days as kind of we go through this unusual series of events.
Sure. I'm a psychologist by training. So I spent the first 10, 15 years of my career working with kids and families outside of the city of Boston. And then a friend of mine was starting a consulting company that got a gig with the United Nations, helping countries strengthen their response to HIV and AIDS. And she brought me in because I know about trauma. And they were working in Cambodia that had just come through the Khmer Rouge. And so I talked to them about teaching emotional intelligence to people who'd lived through trauma. And after I did that, they offered me a job. So I left kind of my therapist world and jumped into leadership.
Gretchen has frozen, but the comment was so interesting because I spent the last evening of my Mount Holyoke career writing a 20-page paper about the Khmer Rouge and Cambodia. So we have another Venn diagram.
Yes.
Sorry, you froze for a second, so I was filling some airtime.
Okay. So for about the last 20 years, I've been doing leadership development in all sorts of organizations. And then kind of simultaneous to that, I spent about a decade writing a book about helping people heal from repeated trauma. And those were sort of separate worlds for much of my work life until the last couple years, where I've really tried to bring them together when it's possible to help communities who are engaging around domestic violence or homelessness or opiates. And now with this crisis, I've been doing a lot of conversations with community leaders about how do you help communities around this crisis.
And like those people that were vulnerable already are 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times more vulnerable now. So really traumatic. We're not talking just anxiety, we're talking real deep trauma.
Well, I've actually been talking to different leaders trying to explain that nobody came to the pandemic a blank slate. Right? So, you know, everybody was coming into 2020 with the things they were coming in with, right? Some people had just finished chemo, some people just lost a family member, and then they have this on top of it, right?
Yeah.
And to really take into account that, you know, everybody wasn't geared up for this.
Yeah. And I've talked to a couple of people who have been to multiple Zoom funerals now, and really how hard that is, because it's not unrelated to COVID other than that they can't gather together. And that inability to grieve in person is kind of, there's no finality. Like you don't kind of get together and have that celebration or that kind of shared. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it brings up the point that nothing about 2020 is what we thought it would be, right? So all of the ideas of our visions and hopes for the year, any rituals, people had to do seders that were online, all the deep rituals that connect us across generations are not what anyone imagined. So there's a lot of grief that goes along even with grief, right? A mix of that.
It's interesting because we work with a lot of online community managers. All of a sudden, everybody's like, online engagement, we need to engage online now. And it's kind of, I keep saying, it's like the people who don't build their network until they're looking for a job. And you're like, oh, it's got to be a little like, people are like juggling their kids and their sick loved ones and their whatever. And now you're asking them to work in new ways and expecting, one of the things that has shocked me the most actually is surveillance of employees. So people who have their employer has embedded surveillance technology on their laptops to make sure they're billable.
Right.
And I think that's a small niche of the market, but a bigger niche of the market is being expected to work 8 hours a day or like a full-time job while you're juggling, like whether or not you have kids. We have somebody on our team who's juggling roommates who they never intended to spend all day with. And it was fine to see them for a couple hours in the evening, but now they're all in this. So everybody's juggling something. What I'm really interested in hearing from you is, what are some, I watched one of your other webinars and I was really struck by some of the good practical advice you had. For people who are dealing with teams or organizations or communities about, how do we set up routines? Like, what do we focus on to help people ground themselves?
Could you repeat the question?
So
for a while.
Yeah, what I'm interested in exploring is kind of the routines that we as leaders can help provide that helps ground our teams or our organizations or our communities. Like, what can we, like practical things. I love some of your suggestions I saw on your previous webinar.
Well, I mean, if we back up a little, I think it's really important that leaders take in, nobody's done this before. Like, there is no game plan for a team functioning in a pandemic, all right? And so I think that sort of what you were alluding to before, you have to engage with your people first. So you have to connect with them, find out what their current, what are their strengths in a pandemic, do they think? And what are their current challenges in a pandemic? I almost feel like everybody needs to add the suffix "in a pandemic" to everything they're saying these days.
That's a great little mental note, actually, is just like, I'm doing this in a pandemic.
Right. We're running our team in a pandemic. I am homeschooling my kid in a pandemic, right? Otherwise, we have this sense that there's some standard by which we should be holding ourselves that doesn't actually exist right now.
Yeah.
I think the second thing about teams is, and I've been saying the same thing about families, you need to have a meeting about how are we gonna, what are the priorities? What are must-haves during this time? And what's the best way for us to work? Which is where I think your work comes in so beautifully, which is, what is I feel like everybody's taking their internal work lives and putting it up online as if it's a one-to-one. And
the repeating theme that I keep having in these conversations is like, stop, like, no, like.
Right. And people are exhausted from Zoom all day.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think it's really important to say, all right, maybe Zoom's really the only needed for us to connect. I see your face. I feel like you get me. You've met my pets and my children, and you understand my context, right? And then the best way to get work done might be one-on-ones. It might be a checklist. It might be, check in the morning for 5 minutes, check in the evening for 5 minutes. But these kind of constant 1 hour Zoom meetings are draining people, and they're unrealistic given the other things that people have to get done, right?
They're not very flexible. Like, if you take the office environment and put that on top of whatever you're dealing with at home, it breaks very quickly.
I think the other thing is that because we're in a pandemic, we need to acknowledge this is the first time there's been this global collective trauma. It's asymmetrical, so it's hitting everybody very differently. But your people, if you're leading a team, your people are worried about their families, even if they're on a pandemic team, right? Or even if they're the medical director of a hospital, they're going home and worrying about whether they're bringing it home. They're worried about their parents. So everybody's carrying a worry through this, and is under more stress. There's no kind of autopilot. Yeah. Everything you do is a decision.
One of the things that I've noticed too is this interesting issue of like, everyone is a little hesitant to share their struggles because they're not as much as somebody else's. Meaning you have this like global trauma, and you can see everyone else's struggles. So you think, well, I am not struggling quite as much, so I'll just keep it to myself. Did you hear that? I froze up again. So I was saying one of the things I've noticed is that people are a little fearful of sharing their own trauma because we can see everybody else's, and we can see that other people's trauma is much bigger than our own. So like our little issue, like,
right.
I even have had this, which is I feel so privileged that I'm like, the issues that I'm having pale, like other issues pale in comparison. So, right. So how do you deal with that psychologically?
Right. So I think we don't need to compare our traumas to each other. What we need to pay attention to for ourselves and for others is how that level of extreme stress is impacting our ability to be engaged with other people and the work we want to do, right? Mm-hmm. So basically, we want to make sure that our bodies and brains are in a decent state, right? Especially if we're the leaders, because, you know, I've been saying the pandemic's not just contagious, so is your mood, right? And if we can if we can think about our mood as the way we think about temperature, it doesn't, without judgment, right? We want to bring down our temperature. We want to bring our mood to a place that's positive enough to get the job done and not frighten people. It doesn't matter whether you have the worst trauma or the least trauma. In some ways, it has the same impact on your brain.
Interesting. Yeah.
So
relative to you, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. And you want to make sure that, you know, in working with teams, you want to have you should have a conversation with your team. Like, what is everybody's signs of stress? How will we know if you need help? Right? And let people get that out. Let people hear what, you know, almost the old rose and thorn conversation. What's the best part of this pandemic for me? What's the worst part of this pandemic for me? Right? Yeah. I mean, people would be like, oh, I love wearing sweatpants, you know, and other people would say, like, I'm getting to see my kids when I didn't used to. And, you know,
I actually asked my team the other day, I was like, what energizes you and what's draining your energy? Because I like that question too, because it's like, what's dragging you down?
That's a great question.
For the similar reason, which is like, let's just get it. And actually, it's funny, I had a call with a team member where I was just like expecting to check up. And as a leader, one of my strategies is always asking how people feel before anything else. Just because people answer it all sorts of different ways, but it starts a conversation in a way that like gets out the needly stuff. And the entire call, we talked about something non-work related. And I was kind of like, this is what this person needs right now.
Right.
And so that's where I'm going to be.
Well, I would encourage most leaders to do that, especially now, to find out how people are feeling. Remember, we feel before we think. That's the research behind emotional intelligence. So if people can get connected to and be aware of what they're feeling, they have a chance then to do something to shift or get help, right? Yeah. And or at least be seen. When you answered, when you asked that question, that person was allowed to be seen for where they were. And then you can be found. It's like hide and seek.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And I feel like that's, and actually we have data in our research to show this. We asked the question about how communities empower that. And one of the biggest ways is feeling seen and heard. And I'm kind of the, nobody is going to engage actively unless they first feel seen and heard. right? Because if you don't feel seen and heard, you have a target on your back. Like if you say something, you feel like that's just a prompt to come get you, right? So to me, that is a fundamental, and one of the greatest things about this pandemic is we're seeing everybody's homes, which is awesome in terms of like breaking that formality that keeps us disconnected.
Yes. I don't know if I should keep talking if you're frozen.
Yeah, well, I hear you.
Okay. I actually was talking to a medical doctor who said that even the telemedicine is better in some ways because doctors can see the parents and the baby in their home and see it's more realistic in some ways than in the office.
Yeah, interesting.
So I think but you have to be human, you have to be authentic, right? And not just transactional.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's that experience of a few years ago, the at-home flub of that guy in the UK whose kid came in the door and he was like mortified, right? Like, cause he was doing, and it turned out he was in his bedroom, but like, he had it so structured. And I feel like that's breaking down and that's a really good thing.
Oh yeah, we can totally thank Jimmy Fallon, I think, for that at this point. You know, I mean, now his kids are like basically his production crew, and
yeah,
I think
there's something very visceral and connecting about that. And it actually goes along with the next question, which is like, how do you get people to move forward? And, you know, when I think about this, I'm like, connection really helps. And then giving some people something they can do that addresses their anxiety, like something constructive. But I would love your perspective on that.
Yeah, I have been advocating for the last month that, you know, the research shows that people who are helpful in times of crises have lower levels of post-traumatic stress disorder. So having agency, feeling like you can be an active participant, even if that active participation is inaction, which is what we've been trying to say, like stay home, right? But feeling like you can add to something. And I think I've actually been talking to a number of organizations where they've asked people to stay home, and those people are used to being on the front lines of some crisis. And that's been really tough. And so I think that's probably another conversation to have as a team, which is what can we do? Some of the work that people are doing isn't possible in the way that they had done it. But I've been really thinking, you know, there are those companies like 3M and Hewlett Packard and different companies that said, all right, a percentage of your work life belongs to you and you get to innovate in that time, one day a week or right? Now is the time for everybody to try that.
Yeah.
Right? So now is the time for everybody, partly because we know cognitively, we come up with more innovation when we're not in our usual space.
Yeah.
Right. So people are now working from home in different rooms. They're going to their kids' classes. They're getting bombarded with stuff that's new, and they're going to look at the old problems a new way, no matter what.
That's so a suggestion. And I've been thinking about it slightly differently, which is, can you donate a percentage of your employees' time or give them a percentage of their time to volunteer or do like whatever in their own community, like whether it's work related or not, like.
Yeah, that's brilliant too. That I think everybody needs to step back and look at it, like go up a level of system and look out, right? Everybody needs to gain some perspective on whether people can contribute to the greater good of the whole organization, right? Or the greater good of a community, but we need to link into a greater good.
Yeah, I was actually just having this conversation with someone who was kind of pondering what's the difference between an organization that is grounded and one that's not. And my response to that is there's a shared purpose that's bigger than we're going to be successful selling our product. Like the product is a solution to something or a service to something. We're trying to fix X or we're trying to serve X. And we do that through our product and services, but It's not about just profitability on the product.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's true for individuals too, meaning that point where individuals experience less post-traumatic stress if you're serving somebody.
Right.
And it's interesting if you overlay that in the context of American culture and some of the individualism that really, like, I think is harmful to our mental health.
Right. Well, I've been talking to a number of groups about resilience, and that American individualism has, and the original research on resilience, which was done kind of on white men in the 50s, was, resilience resides inside the individual. It's my resources, my strengths, my capacity, my flexibility, whatever, it resides inside me. And for a lot of people, that still feels true. But the further research on resilience showed that there are actually other places people can find resilience. And one is with groups or other people, right? I find my resilience in my community or on my team. And that's a little bit harder right now because you have to stretch or you have to use other means to do that.
Yeah.
And the third way people find resilience is in something bigger than themselves, a higher power, a belief system, their purpose. So, and I kind of look at it like a pie chart. Like we probably have different pie wedges of those resilience pieces, and we might have to lean on other ones during this crisis because the first one isn't as available to us.
Yeah, I mean, this gets to one of the one last thing I wanted to share, but I'll share it because it's related to this, which is we just did a addendum survey to our annual research survey because we collected all the data before COVID hit, and we were like, we got to figure out what impact this has had on programs. Otherwise, our analysis is like already aged. And I threw in a question at the end, just kind of shits and giggles, like I said, about how are people feeling?
Yeah.
And I gave them like 8 options or whatever. And then when we got the data, I split it by members of, oh, you can't hear me. Can you hear me now? No, you can't hear me now.
I can hear you.
You can hear me. Can you turn off your video? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Yeah, okay. You may want to turn off your video. It'll help your Wi-Fi. I think it's your Wi-Fi that's glitching.
I have really fast Wi-Fi. I don't understand.
I don't know. We did. So anyways, I split this data about how community managers were feeling by our members versus community managers on the whole. And it was fascinating because over 50% of the people who are in our online community were feeling energized or empowered, which was awesome. But the average, over 50%, were either anxious or very anxious. And so, to me, that was a good community in a nutshell.
Right.
Which is like those other people help you reframe, come back from the emotional edge, kind of reground yourself so that you can then go out again.
Right. That we need the whole group, and on any given day, right?
Yes.
Somebody's in the I got this camp.
Yes.
And somebody's
right.
not.
And you pull the people who are anxious back in and kind of say, okay, we're going to norm you to the rest of us. And if on any given day, 20% of us are anxious and 80% of us are not, we can all maintain our empowerment.
Yeah.
So that was like I think there's a lesson there for leaders, right? Which is how can you bring people together so that people can help each other, and that, as you ebb and flow emotionally, there's always somebody there for you. Right.
And really valuing, that's about a leader creating a climate, right?
Yes.
That says people's feelings are okay and we're going to help each other, right? Rather than, I'm seeing a number of leaders kind of frightened themselves by their bottom line, kind of really talking down to their people, and their people are making everybody anxious rather than saying, we'll figure this out. We'll get through it together, or we won't, but whatever it is, we'll do it together, right?
Well, and I've seen a couple of instances there too, and it's a communications issue, which is leadership closes around itself and is like, we're going to figure this out and then we'll let you know. And we all know like anxieties of like love a vacuum, right? So the monster in the closet is always bigger than the monster you can see. And so by not having that shared conversation and shared sense making about what's going on, also, it's too slow. By the time you as leaders have figured out what's going on, you're 5 days too late right now, or worse.
Right. Yeah, right. In the absence of story, people will make one up.
Yeah.
Right? And this is fast moving. I think that's the other thing that's really important, is that you need to lead and have a plan, and you need to hold that plan kind of lightly or tenderly, because it will shift and move. It's growing. This whole thing is moving.
The way I heard somebody talk about this was people crave certainty, and you have no certainty about the future right now.
Right.
And so then you have to refocus on what is certain. And if you know what your values are, you know what your purpose is, you know who you are, like being self-aware, all those things you can be certain about. And people need that certainty to feel secure. They don't necessarily need the certainty about the future, but you need to be certain about something.
Exactly.
And so kind of helping people have that conversation, I think, is really helpful too. So before we wrap up, I always have this like one last thing. What have you seen lately that's been interesting or captured your imagination, or is like,
this is gonna feel like a non sequitur, but I don't think it is. So Billy Collins, the poet, has been doing these Facebook Live poetry readings. So he reads 3 poems, and it's essentially like the best English class you've ever taken in your entire life in 20 minutes. Professor. And it's a reminder that art right now, in times of uncertainty, actually poetry, which doesn't require whole paragraphs, is a way to figure out what you're thinking. A reminder that you can, like, any new perspective might help where we are. And so I'm sort of reminded now to sort of go back to pieces of literature, pieces of art, poems, places where we can find ways of grabbing on to understanding new things.
You know what I think of when I think of that, and this is where it connects, which is it's the front end of innovation before we have language for something. Yes. Right? We throw something at the wall, literally, and then it's other people who look at that and create shared meaning around it and say, oh, I think this is what that person was trying to express with this. And slowly it becomes more tangible.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that is happening because it's all driven by emotion, which, so that's a great outlet. And it's actually a great recommendation for people, is to like, and it's a great recommendation for me. I have had a art supply kit in my closet for like 3 years. Something I always wanted to do. I should get that out right now and just throw some color at a canvas.
Yeah.
And see what happens. Well, Gretchen, this has been a fabulous conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope it's been helpful for people who are listening. And yeah, we're all figuring this out.
Yep, to be continued.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Have a great Friday.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.